Melchizedek. I'm not even sure if I'm pronouncing it right. But here's the problem that was going on amongst the Hebrew believers in Rome and in Italy. They were accepting substitutes. Substitutes that couldn't accomplish what they were asking them to do. Have you ever been ordering groceries online and then it says, there's a box check, we'll accept substitutes? How many of you ever checked that box and regret it when the groceries arrived? Raise your hand, seriously. Yeah, because sometimes there's just certain products, there's just no substitute than the original. There's just not. How many of you ever ordered generic copier toner? How many of you are going to do that again? Right? There's just sometimes where the substitute is so much less than it's not worth even purchasing. And when it comes to your soul, never settle for anything less than the best. And the Jewish people here, they were settling. They were settling. It was good intentioned. It's well intentioned. A lot of our settling is good intentioned, but too often our settling is the path of least resistance, which is not fruitful for our soul. So let's read Hebrews 7, just the first few verses. Like I said, we're going to finish in Hebrews 7 next week. This Melchizedek was the king of Salem and the prince of the Most High. El Elyon was the Hebrew word. And so Melchizedek means king of righteousness, and then Salem, probably that was the original name for the city Jerusalem, which means peace. So Melchizedek is the king of righteousness, and he's the king of peace. Those thoughts are important today. He met Abraham returning from the defeat of the kings and blessed him. And Abraham gave him a tenth of everything. First, the name Melchizedek means king of righteousness, then also king of Salem, meaning king of peace. Without father or mother, without genealogy, without beginning of days or end of life, resembling the Son of God. He remains a priest forever. Just think how great he was. Even the patriarch Abraham gave him a tenth of the plunder. Now, the law requires the descendants of Levi who become priests to collect the tenth from the people. That is, from their fellow Israelites. I know, probably lost you already. This is why we skip over it. Even though they are also descendants from Abraham. Why does this matter? This man, however, did not trace his descent from Levi, yet he collected a tenth from Abraham and blessed him who had the promises. And without doubt, the lesser is blessed by the greater. In the one case, the tenth is collected by people who die. But in the other case, by him who is declared to be living. One might even say that Levi, who collects the tenth, paid the tenth through Abraham. Because when Melchizedek met Abraham, Levi was still in the body of his ancestor. Herein is why you skip over this part. Stay close to the notes if I can today. Like a meteor, quoting lots of people that have studied this, and I've studied it. Melchizedek pops on Abraham's story and just simply disappears. He shows up in Psalm 110, verse 4, where it says, "Thou art a priest forever after the order of Melchizedek," referencing God's son. And then we have him in Hebrews 5 and in Hebrews 7. And in Hebrews 7, Hebrews 5, when he brings in the name, he says, "Listen, I could tell you more, but you're so far away from where you need to be, I'm not even going to try." And apparently by the time he gets to chapter 7, the scribe that's he's talking to goes, "Okay, I told them they weren't ready for it, but they're never going to be ready for it. Just let's talk about Melchizedek." And so that's kind of what's going on here. But here's what Charles Spurgeon said. We see little of him, speaking of Melchizedek, yet we see nothing little in him. Interesting quote, isn't it? We see little of him, but there's nothing little about this figure, Melchizedek. I'm going to go deeper into the author's discussion of this topic, but there's some necessary things to make a point of today. And we're going to conclude with this meal, and I'm going to describe what I believe it's going to symbolize for all of us today in just a moment. That's what this bread and this cup represents. It's okay to think about it as communion, but understand this, that Passover never happened yet. And so communion, as you and I know it, wasn't even a dream in the eyes of the Jewish people yet. So this is something different, though it's fine for you to receive it this way, and many of you I know will, and that's going to be fine. The Jewish Christians in Italy were struggling to ease the spiritual pushback. Many were considering going back to being the Jews they were before they met Jesus. They're practicing religious syncretism, that is, mixing two things. And there's certain things that just don't mix well. The reason you got to keep shaking up the vinegar and oil dressing is because vinegar and oil, water and oil just does not mix. You got to continually shake it up because they're never ever going to mix. And in these days of personal autonomy and the rise of the triumphant self, as some people call it, syncretism is a thing because people bringing in their feelings into empirical truth. And the minute you bring feelings into what is empirically true, subjective feelings into what is empirically true, well, you lose what's really true. And that's what was happening to the Jews. And the way I'm analogizing it is they were spilling a lot of new wine. Jesus warned about this, didn't he? Their actions were illustrating Jesus' reasons for warning against putting new wine in old wineskins. They were trying to take the new covenant, put it back in the old covenant, and it wasn't working. And so consequently, they were spilling lots of wine. And what did spiritual wine, what did then the writer in Hebrews say in chapter 5? You're going to have to start all over and get brand new wineskin to even embrace this. In so many words, that's what he was saying. Fellowship with God the Jesus way required them leaving the Mosaic way. It just did. The Mosaic way was to prepare them for the Jesus way, and then they're to leave it behind. Concerning the priesthood of Melchizedek and to the Levitical priest, let's real quick go to Genesis 14. And I'll just read this little section where Melchizedek's encounter with Abraham is described, and I went back and marked it, and here we go. It says that Abraham met Melchizedek, verse 18. Then Melchizedek, king of Salem, brought out bread and wine. He was the priest of the God Most High, and he blessed him. Now, one thing that this does, it shows that from the moment of the garden onward, God was manifesting himself to a people. That God has always had a people. And Melchizedek was appointed by God to be a priest. It's very significant to this illustration why the priesthood of Jesus is superior to the priesthood of Moses and the priesthood of the Levitical priest and the priesthood of Aaron is because Jesus was a priest after the order of Melchizedek, which was an eternal priesthood, an appointed priesthood, not related to who your father was, except for the fact that God the Father was the father of Jesus. But nonetheless, God had appointed Melchizedek, El Elyon, Most High God, to be a priest. So it was not by lineage, it was by appointment. That's the significant part of the superiority of Christ's priesthood in this illustration. Verse 18. So Melchizedek, king of Salem, brought out bread and wine. He was the priest of God Most High, and he blessed Abram, saying, Blessed be Abram by God Most High, creator of heaven and earth, and praise be to God Most High, who delivered your enemies into your hand. Then Abraham gave him a tenth of everything. And that's all that's said about Melchizedek. Like a meteor, he arises and then he disappears, only to be discussed a couple other places in the Bible. Follow the bullet point thinking here, okay? This is just a logical progression. Melchizedek meant king of righteousness and the king of peace. He was the priest of the Most High God by appointment. Just follow the logic here. The great Abraham, even though he'd already received God's promise, recognized Melchizedek as greater than him. Now, if you ask a Jew, a non-Christian Jew to this day, they will say, Abraham's the guy. And that was the challenge that the Hebrews had towards Jesus. We're the children of Abraham, and what are you saying? Because that was their strength, that was their identity. But here it says that Melchizedek was greater than Abraham. A strong challenge to some Hebraic Jewish thinking. And it says that he recognized Melchizedek as greater and gave then Melchizedek a tithe, a tenth. Melchizedek had no beginning or end, being made like the Son of God. Was this Jesus? I'm going to say no, but it depends on the day of the week. I believe it was a typology of Christ. All these stresses of no descendants and no heritage. It's stressing the point that this priesthood is very unique and distinct from the Mosaic priesthood. I think that's what's being illustrated here. There were pre-incarnate appearances, theophanies of Jesus in the Old Testament. There's a lot of those. But I think in this case, he's making the point that just simply making the point that Melchizedek's priesthood was better than the Mosaic priesthood. Don't go back to the Mosaic priesthood. Stay with the priesthood of Jesus because it's on the same order as the priesthood of Melchizedek. And this word in the Greek, aphomonios, means a facsimile or a copy. It really doesn't mean the same as, and that's probably the concluding argument, though you will read many, many people who will say this is Jesus. And maybe yesterday I would have said that, maybe tomorrow I will, but today I'm saying it was a type. It's just like the serpent on the pole. The serpent on the pole represented Jesus for a moment to illustrate a point and to make a point. Here's what Henrik Meyer said, though. It was as if the Father could not wait until the day of his Son's priestly entrance within the veil, but needed to anticipate the marvels of his ministry by embodying its leading features in miniature. And that's the way one scholar has tried to describe what happened. But as commanded by the law of Moses, the Levitical priests received tithes from every Israelite. Even though Melchizedek was not a Levite, we're looking at a logical progression, and this would matter a lot to a Jew in that day, maybe not so much to you, but it is emphasizing the superiority of Jesus Christ. Don't ever leave Jesus Christ. Even though he was not a Levite, Melchizedek received Abraham's tithe. Before he gave Abraham a blessing, Melchizedek gave Abraham bread and wine. Being greater than Abraham, Melchizedek blessed Abram. This blessing was not the simple wishing of good, something which even the most subordinate might offer superior. Melchizedek's blessing as priest of the Most High was authorized to affirm God's good intentions on Abraham and his seed. The idea being that in Melchizedek was the Levitical priest, and so even the Levitical priest paid tithes to Melchizedek, simply arguing that Melchizedek is the superior priesthood. Now let's think about this bread and wine for just a moment. If you're still in Genesis 14, I want you to notice something. And if the musicians could come. In verse 17 it says, after Abram returned from defeating Kilhamedor, the kings allied with him. The king of Sodom came out to meet him in the valley of Jeveth, that is in the king's valley. And in verse 22 it says, verse 21 he says, and the king of Sodom said to Abram, give me the people and keep the goods for yourself. But Abram said to the king of Sodom with raised hand, I've sworn an oath to the Lord God Most High, creator of heavens and earth. I will not accept anything but what my men have eaten and the share that belongs to the men who went with me. And here's why he did that. Because I do not want anyone to be able to claim that someone other than El Elyon made me rich. Exclamation point. Now, the symbolism of the meal. The king of righteousness and the king of peace fed Abram. It was in his power to do this for Abram. And this marked a starting point in Abram's life where he had to actually make a decision. Am I going to align with these other pagan kings, or will I stay aligned with El Elyon? It was a starting point for Abram. And he chose to stay aligned with God. God had already blessed him. Melchizedek simply reaffirmed it. Jesus has saved us. We take communion all the time to simply reaffirm that salvation. During this next song, I'm going to ask all of you to come forward, no matter the context of your home right now, to come and receive this meal. You can break off a piece. You can dip it. I've got extra juice, and there's more bread if we need it. You know, don't break off a quarter of the loaf. But as we sing this song, I want you to come forward symbolically as a starting point. And the story I'll tell to maybe further emphasize this is a Ukrainian pastor is being interviewed. Your nation. No, he said, we're rebuilding our nation. And the person said, how can you be doing that? The war isn't even over yet. He said, well, we have to build where we are, and we're not where we want to be. He said, many of our children are going to be orphans now. Many of our daughters are now widows. Many of our daughters will not have men to marry. We're not starting where we want to start, but we have to start. And he said, every family in Ukraine has a new starting point nearly every day. And he talked about the mercies of God being new every morning. And I think for us as Christians, we need a starting point, a time to recommit and to refocus, especially on Father's Day perhaps. And so I'm going to ask that we come as family groups. If you're an individual, that's great. Bring a friend. It's not going to be forced anyone, but I want us just to come, receive this meal, and just believe for your family the peace that can come from righteousness. That righteousness that was purchased by Jesus, and the peace that can result. And believe that to become true in your home and with your children and with your grandchildren. Can we do that? Okay, let's sing together, and I'm going to ask Cindy and Beth to come, and we're going to